So our first speaker is going to be Eugene McNamee, Professor and Head of School of Law at Ulster University, with a paper entitled Liminality in No Man's Land, Disease in Northern Ireland.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Eugene.
I can be heard, I take it? Yes, indeed.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to the organizers of the conference. Thanks very much for allowing me to participate. My paper, picking up on RPAD themes, is not so closely connected to the pandemic, except insofar as some of the events in it are cotemporous with the pandemic, at least as far as we've experienced it over the last year or so. So I'll try to keep my paper to about 15 minutes, and this paper somehow for me took shape in written form, so I'm going to read it out. Sometimes they come in a different way, but this one came as a written paper, so I'm going to read that out. In the abstract to this paper, I described Northern Ireland as politically ill-defined and ill at ease, and there's an irony, at least for this conference and this panel, entitled Disease, Technology and the Digital Panopticon, in the fact that the latest in a long line of events to illustrate that shape-shifting and diseased condition relies precisely on the lack of a sufficiently precise form of electronic equipment that might seamlessly track and trace the movements of goods across borders in such a way as to render superfluous any in-person customs, regulatory, or provenance checks. Put it another way, because of Brexit and the lack of a digital panopticon that might have allowed authorities to follow virtually, for example, a Dutch tulip bulb to a dealer in Doncaster by way of Dublin docks, the issue of hard borders involving certain goods having their passports, as it were, physically checked, raised its head. And because of the inevitable interplay for a political community between border definition and identity, both as legal rights and as sense of belonging and security, long simmering and barely concealed tensions began to strain the fragile bonds that held the Northern Irish political community together under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And the community fractured once again into the communities at odds with each other around the question of whether the border should follow the contours of the nation state, necessitating customs checks and a de facto hard border within the island of Ireland, or the more convenient sea border between the islands of Ireland and Great Britain. Maintaining some degree of harmony such that the being at odds of these communities did not descend into something much more tragic was taken as a common priority by the larger political beasts of the European Union and the United Kingdom. And the lack of an agreement on how to square the circle of the Northern Irish border problem threatened to derail the prospect of an overall agreement on the entirety of Brexit arrangements. The eventual solution, for want of the missing panopticon, was the Northern Irish Protocol, which would see Northern Ireland nominally exit the EU customs union, but adopt the EU single market standards, which in turn would create a need for regulatory checks at Northern Irish ports for goods passing back and forth between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, the border down the Irish Sea solution. Northern Ireland would be treated as a liminal space, not in the EU customs union, but an entry point to it, de jure outside the EU customs union and de facto inside, having a foot in both camps, or falling between two stools, depending on your point of view, being not one thing or the other. Whether or not it is accounted an eventual success or not remains to be seen, and there are, of course, many interested parties willing to put a thumb on the scale of history to tip the balance one way or the other, meaning, for example, that some people are more attuned to the economic possibilities of having a foot in both camps, while others privilege the potential constitutional implications. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that the condition of constitutional ambiguity is perfectly in tune with the Good Friday Agreement itself. The agreement to disagree, animated self-consciously by notions of constructive ambiguity in order not to impose one thing or another, British or Irish identity, but allow for a sense of either or both at the same time. It had set in place compulsory power sharing governmental arrangements between unionists in favor of union with Great Britain and nationalists in favor of an all-island nation of Ireland, pledging to accord parity of esteem to each political tradition and to institutionalize the idea of the legitimate aspirations of each to either remain in the United Kingdom or to leave it. A function of that agreement between two identified political traditions, presumably unintentional but nevertheless foreseeable, was to lock into place a kind of overlaid tribal and political identification process, a presumption of disagreement as a permanent condition, and thus a situation of perennial constitutional dis-ease, accompanied by a self-perpetuating realignment of peace as the absence of violence into peace process as the continuously auto-generative industrial scale effort to achieve a social normality within a governmental structure paradoxically designed to foster disassociation. Part of the accompanying institutionalization of the agreement, and one of the most visible and symbolically significant, had been the removal of physical checks on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, between the North and the South. And it was agreed by the EU and the UK that to go back to border controls would be against the spirit, if not the letter, of the Good Friday Agreement, and would at the limit bear the strong potential to reignite civil strife and undo the status of Northern Ireland as, from the outside looking in and from a safe distance, the world's favorite solved problem. No doubt influenced by the greater security offered by the sea option and balancing the prospect of strife caused by a border in the sea versus strife caused by a border on land, the parties had come down in the sea. Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. A mitigating feature, so far as some were concerned, was that the protocol would stand to be periodically renewed or rejected by the Northern Ireland Assembly, the first such review due in 4 years' time. And so the situation remains delicately balanced. There are declarations of opposition to the protocol from some unionist parties, and it remains unclear the extent to which there is a sufficiently strongly held sentiment, even by a limited group of extremists, that are willing to take opposition in the direction of violence. And even if they were to do so, whether this would be of such a quality and extent to threaten the operation of the protocol and lead to large-scale civil tumult. Meanwhile, the application of the protocol itself continues quietly in the background, albeit with attendant logistical problems of inadequate infrastructure to conduct the necessary checks, in turn a function of obstructionist political attitudes by the relevant minister, rather than fundamental difficulties of scale or type. A perhaps ominous and certainly disturbing in many different ways portent arrived yesterday in the shape of a delegation from the Loyalist Communities Council, which is a representative group representing supposedly ex-paramilitary groups, but that are acknowledged to be existing paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland, appearing before the Northern Ireland Affairs UK Parliamentary Select Committee to warn through a 19-year-old delegate, who of course hadn't been born at the time that the Good Friday Agreement was settled, that should the Northern Ireland Protocol not be removed entirely, then violent opposition to it could not be ruled out, and that the timeline was in months rather than in years. When I committed to this paper, it was with the intent to frame an analysis of the events described above in terms of the parasite, parasitology, and parasitism, drawing on the work of Michel Serres in order to do so, knowing something of Serres' work and knowing that he had written a seminal text on the theme of the parasite. This seemed like a promising approach in that an obvious paradigmatic character for our common sense notion of the parasite, understood in human social terms, is the smuggler, profiting from the difference in price and availability from one side of a border to the other. Further, the newspapers offered myriad examples of political opportunism, betrayal, and unintended consequence that all seemed potentially to have relations to notions of parasite. Further still, Northern Ireland itself has often been figured as a parasite, leeching the lifeblood of the British state, financially, spiritually, militarily. An analysis which would draw out the chains of parasitic relationship around the Northern Ireland aspects of the Brexit process might, I suppose, throw a new light on the Northern Ireland situation of enduring community tension and a doggedly oppositional politics despite a generation having passed since the conflict's end. The novelty of the theoretical approach might throw some reflected back on the world itself, perhaps, or perhaps on the value of the theory, should the journey prove to be somewhat of a dead end. Turning to explore Serre's work on the parasite, I was immediately struck, as those of you familiar with his work and more familiar than I will also have been, I'm sure, and in particular with his particular very precise use of the term to incorporate the usual significance in English of a parasite as either a biological or social being that takes without giving, usually just enough to maintain the host alive but debilitated. A third significance to the term, drawn from the French parasite, of the parasite as the background noise or static which accompanies and sometimes drowns out a message or form of communicative order. Think of an analog radio not quite attuned to a station, or of the background hum and crackle of a vinyl LP before the song kicks in. For Serre, I began to understand the parasite as static is inseparable from any given message or order, is the raw material from which it emerges. And his work as a philosopher is not to theorize a rescue of the order from the noise, as say Luhmann, but to somehow address at the same time both the order and the noise in social relations, as well as, and at the same time as, addressing the primary meanings of parasitism as the exploitation and debilitation of a host. On reading more into Serre, admittedly only a fraction of his voluminous output over the years, I gained the impression that the parasite as an idea was one amongst a series of ideas and concepts explored by Serre for its contingent value, rather than a foundational key that absolutely opened up the rest of his work. And that's an impression that I'll have to rethink, having seen some of the comments by other participants in this conference. But nonetheless, that was my interim conclusion. I concluded that hunting for parasites in Northern Ireland in the normally understood sense would be a relatively trivial fish in a barrel shooting exercise, and that insofar as the parasite remained interesting for this essay, its primary interest lay in this third element of order and noise as an inseparable duality. Here is Serre from the last page of his book, The Parasite. The parasite doesn't stop. It doesn't stop eating or drinking or yelling or burping or making thousands of noise or filling space with its swarming and din. The parasite is an expansion. It runs and grows. It invades and occupies. All of a sudden, from these pages, inundation, swelling waters, noises, din, clamor, fury, tumult, and non-comprehension, asymmetry, violence, murder and carnage, arrow and axe, misery, hunger, poverty, begging at the doors, those who eat too much, drunk, those who never have anything but wind to chew on, sickness, epidemics, the plague, animal metamorphoses, bacteria, insects, rats, wolves, lions, and foxes, animals devoured by politics, flowers of the bouquet of love eaten by a hare, lovers separated by the devil. This is a good, if brief, illustration of the general, notable, and much noted strangeness of Serre's writing, through which he attempts to deal with order and noise simultaneously. His multivalent and multi-thematic approaches to his philosophical concerns are filled with allegory, parable, anecdote, roaming through mathematics, literature, mythology, physics, pushing things always towards big questions of time, meaning, communications, beginnings, foundations, origins, and ends. Searching for a way to turn things back to Northern Ireland as a liminal, diseased space, I became fascinated by what seemed to me a turn in some of his later works, notably Times of Crisis, towards a broadly ecological analysis of the current phase of human and worldly, in the sense of the earth itself, development as a kind of dance of death where the world and humanity have entered a new phase of relations. In Serre's analysis, the world can be no longer taken as a simple object backdrop to the affairs of humanity, the subject, a stage on which politics, the important stuff, happens, but rather the world has, because of the destructive and irreverent behavior of humanity, taken on a rampant subjectivity, displayed in fires, floods, droughts, pandemics, and all the manifestations of ecological breakdown to which we have become accustomed. It is now, that is the world itself, in a position of very often making the first move, forcing the conversation, making humanity dance to its tune. The question, therefore, is not one of ethics, that we shouldn't harm the world, but one of ontology, that the world isn't waiting around for us to harm it or not. It has taken on an agency to match our own. The world has become a paradigm of the quasi-object, the restless entity that shifts position back and forth from subject to object, where the old asymmetrical and parasitical separation of subject and object no longer exists. Every subject becomes object and every object subject. The world that humanity has created in this Anthropocenic age now falls on our heads. Humanity in this dance has entered a liminal phase of hominescence, akin to fluorescence, luminescence, phosphorescence. Let's call it shining lightedness, of being at the measure of the gods, the measure of world destruction, the measure of angelic capacity in its winged movement and its fleetness and power of communication, flying close to the sun. And the question becomes one of whether this godlike creature will manage to embrace the status of having the power to dance the world onto higher planes, or whether, like Icarus, we're in the phase of glorious ascent prior to a catastrophic fall. One part of the answer for Sayre harks back to his book, The Natural Contract, the need for legal personality attributed in representation somehow accorded by way of life and earth scientists to the primary elements of the earth, water, air, fire, earth, life, waffle, to recognize a new non-national territory of biogea. Insofar as this constitutes a plea for a novel form of legalism in relation to ecological issues, it is strange, utopic, rather than revolutionary. There are certainly other theorists attracted to the idea of ascribing legal personality to ecological elements. And legal personality in and of itself is a concept often and easily divorced from natural persons. Another part of the answer is more typically enigmatic and perhaps might be described as a plea for an ethical and epistemological move towards the soft, love, a set of knowledges, technologies, and practices, precisely those relating to intervention and access. Today, this is Sayre's words, an unpredictable bifurcation is taking place. It is the end of the hard and the beginning of the soft. It concerns not only the soft of morality, but also of codes, the theoretical, scholarly, and work-related soft. We have arrived at the deep tectonic plate where encounters, short circuits, and ruptures between hard and soft provokes earthquakes. He comments, I would like to write stories, songs, poems, and 1,000 enthusiastic texts to encourage every woman and man to intervene in a timely or untimely manner in every public affair, whether it is their business or not. This immediately rung a somewhat counterintuitive bell in my head about poetry in general and Northern Irish poetry in particular. In the second half of the 20th century, the axis of poetic output in Ireland turned towards the north. Seamus Heaney, the most famous and most accomplished of that generation of poets, and to boot an extremely sensitive commentator on poetry generally and his place within the tradition, acknowledged in his book, The Government of the Tongue, the education in meaning and discipline that had been provided by the need to be linguistically circumspect in Northern Ireland through his formative years, and also the place of language in the constitutional essence of a place, recalling Shelley's notion of the poet as the unacknowledged legislator, in response to which Heaney had written his own, The Unacknowledged Legislator's Dream, in his collection North. Poets, in other words, take on the task of working in codes that relate to intervention and access, of standing as a kind of cultural antenna that self-consciously draws down a recognizable signal from the vast sea of noise. And in that very maneuver, and because precisely of its recognizable craft in so doing, keeps the sea of noise ever lapping at the shores of meaning. I have written elsewhere of how, in my view, the poets had foreshadowed the capacity of the politicians in Northern Ireland to create an imaginative territory on which it was possible to be one, both, neither. And Heaney in particular, although certainly not alone, carried huge cultural heft on the issue of defining the Northern Irish condition as one of permanent dis-ease. There are new voices out there, notably female voices, while the generation of conflict poets was almost exclusively male. Perhaps the best that we can hope for is the constant work of renewal continues apace to confront each crisis, that poets can parasite the parasites into a manageable condition of symbiosis. And of course, but nonetheless problematically, when I talk of poetry, there is plenty of room to expand that concept, even in the direction of technology. In each case, a creation that creates. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. So we have two discussants for this paper, Bjorn and Kieran.
I guess I'll answer the discussants if there's any question within their comments, and then take questions from the floor separately, if that's okay. But I'm very mindful of the time constraints, so please, Paul, feel free to manage strictly the running order of the program.
Okay, so Paul, I start with a few comments. And I'm really going to be very brief. I really enjoyed the paper, Eugene, and it was interesting for me to see how you link to the question, not just of Northern Ireland, but to the question of borders. And it actually struck me that there's work on the parasite is a lot about space. It's about stations and paths and dots and lines, right? It's all about that distribution of space, but he mentions borders very, very little. And that is in itself interesting. So I wonder how you kind of would think with Sayre's kind of spatial discussion and how borders can come into that discussion, as this is not what Sayre's writing about, but about dots, station, not that what connects, but what happens with a border that limits. The word actually borders and boundaries is hardly there in the book. He does have an interesting sentence though on the passport and the control of passports, which I found actually also striking. That's in the part where he talks about the master and the slave. And he writes that the master always knows where the slave goes and will go. He has marked the entrances and exits and has stamped the passports. So that's the role of the master. So that is interesting. So that's just a common reflection on borders in the work of Sayre. The other one is of course about liminality, which is really interesting and just open question I still have, and trying to read Sayre as you are, and what is the role of liminality and the parasite, and how can we think those two notions together? Interestingly, Sayre invokes the word liminal once in the book, on page 246, and it's actually in his discussion of love. And it struck me because I didn't know this person. He's talking about this liminal figure, Jean-François Rameau, a musician from the 18th century, who is this person who is never outside, never inside, liminal, subliminal, what he wins, he loses, he liquidates it. And I was just puzzled about that figure that I didn't know about, but actually Diderot wrote an entire book about Rameau that was so somehow important for the French Enlightenment thinking. That so it's one of the many allusions that Sayre has in this book connected exactly to the question of the liminal. But the question I still would like to discuss more is like liminality and the parasite, how we can think those two together. All for me.
Are you responding, Eugene, just to?
Okay, I'm happy to respond. Very briefly, I suppose it's, insofar as I understand Sayre's writing, it's surprising that he doesn't mention borders very much, but I suppose if I read into what I think I understand from his writings, about that, I suppose the border is always slipping away. The border is never existent in the space where you think it's going to be, because you're always reading the no man's land, to borrow a phrase of my own, that's just beyond the border. But that creates a problem for law, which I think was going to be addressed in Rachel's paper on Smith, that sometimes there are borders, and sometimes there are very definite limits, and sometimes there are security posts that define those borders very easily. So conceptually, I can understand how you can avoid the notion of borders, but practically and particularly legally, it's kind of unavoidable. So for my topic, I had to talk a little bit about borders. Liminality, I think it's very interesting. This later Sarah notion about hominescence, so that we're approaching a particular phase in the relationship between humankind and the world. So I think that insofar as there's a grand period of liminality that we might, if by liminality we mean something in grand terms that defines, that is epoch defining, or the gap between one epoch and another, I think it's in his later work that it becomes really fascinating, this notion of whether it all depends on us, and it depends on us that it depends on us right now, in his reading of where we are, and can we manage it? Can we manage all this choice we have? I mean, that's open to interrogation in itself, of course, the degree to which he ascribes this, he has this kind of utopic bent to his writings, and the degree to which he ascribes capacity and grace to humanity is questionable, but nonetheless, it's worth following as an idea. I think certainly I'm going to follow it a little bit further and try and figure out exactly what he's talking about.
You're referring here to the natural contract?
Well, I've just dipped into some later works as well. So the first part about borders, borders has, that's kind of puts it in a legal sphere, but the natural contract is really about this relationship to the world. So the natural contract goes then together with this times of crisis, and then the subsequent works about this grand ecological turn in the Earth's condition that matches this grand, should we call it, communicative turn in humanity's condition. I think that's how I'd read what is the last 10 years or so of his output.
Okay, so Arpad, are you you're going to be the assistant?
Yes, I just drop in two meta comments. First is that Kieran evidently somehow didn't manage to join. The second is that we wanted to have discussion for the papers, among other reasons. So that was Agnes's idea, because given that on the internet and it's so difficult and so confusing, that it's better at least to have some feedback. But maybe there is time for discussion, or we'll see how it will go on. Just very quickly, because I'm just dropped in the last minute really. I think Eugene's paper sort of has a number of connections to other papers and the theme of the conference, which I just want to highlight. The first point is the link between the Brexit and this lockdown, which is sort of a kind of obscure or a kind of indirect and long shot connection. But I think there is certainly somehow it is a part of the back of everything. It's probably everybody realizes that how much in a kind of Eurozone there is a kind of anticipation that the UK will not be able to handle it as well as the EU is handling, and it opens up, of course, a kind of can of worm of politics which you don't want to enter, but it's just in the back of it. So it's an interesting insight, not just from the UK but from Northern Ireland, which is even more complicated into this. The second is Michel Serre and the parasite and parasitology, which is several other papers will be discussing the work of Michel Serre, which of course has a kind of evident connection at one level, because Serre is writing about the parasite and the virus and the bacteria, and all of these things are parasites, and which makes his work, which was already very actual in a certain way, twice actual. And actually, I think that the parasite is really a kind of key. But Serre wrote a lot of books. I mean, over 60 books, which is quite amazing. But the parasite is a kind of concluding volume of his series on Hermes and communication. And what is interesting is that, in a way, these are the two keywords in this entire pandemic thing. On the one hand, the parasite, and on the other hand, the telecommunication network and channel, and what renders possible in the full ambivalence of this term, or communication and also on our enclosing. And I think this was partly is in Serres' horizon all the time. So the communication as a kind of problem, Hermes, the trickster, and the communication. And then the third point, which Eugene again brings in, is the ecological crisis and this entire ecological dimension and this connection to both the parasite and the pandemic and everything like that. So Serres' work on the parasite, on communication, and on the ecological kind of crisis really is an extremely important whatever background and milestone or tool to understand all of that. I just want to make two comments towards the ends of what of Eugene's talk, when he mentioned that it's not simply an ethical but an ontological issue, which is very, very important. Of course, it has an ethical element, everything related to parasites and pandemics and then the ecological crisis. But the ontological element is very important, is how much, that is central, and I think it comes out of Björn's paper, but anyway, how much we are, according to Serres, especially through agriculture, but of course even more through industry, parasites on the planet, and our parasitical role is destroying whatever is the ecological system or the environment around us. And two important points about this ontology mentioned by Eugene, but very important. One, the reference basically to the pre-Socratics and their vision about their non-Newtonian vision of the world. And it also ties up, of course, to Agnes, that it's a very important point that are we supposed to be in a Newtonian kind of scientific world which comes out of this parasitic pandemic discussion, or actually the pre-Socratics vision of the Earth, meaning the basic elements, was it better? And I think it's not a trivial issue that the Newtonian logic of science is better than the pre-Socratic vision of the world about the basic elements are, whatever in the different versions, earth and fire and the air, and isn't that a more ecologically sustainable vision of the world than our Newtonian science? And the second point about poems, which is, again, it's a very interesting sort of a northwestern, southeastern European axis, I think, that, if you talk in, France or Germany, and of course there are many poets there that, they're talking about the experts, and, you have to ask economists and politicians and things like that. But there is something in the old Irish, just as in the old Hungarian vision of the world, which says that, the poets are really the spokesperson of our, and in a way, legislators of our world in an ecological sense. So it's the pre-Socratics and the poets whom we should, in a certain way, listen instead of listening to the experts who, first of all, get everything wrong all the time before the fact, and then after the facts explain why we were all stupid in the first round and should have listened to them. And maybe our point in organizing a political anthropological meeting is to question the rule of the experts. Poets and pre-Socratic philosophers maybe are more helpful. So I'm seconding to Eugene. Thank you. So Paul, I think you should round up.
Okay, so Eugene, do you want to come back in on any of Arpad's points?
No, I'm very happy to leave. I thought they're all very well made points, and I'm glad that Arpad ended on the poetic point, because I'm really struggling to kind of articulate. There's more there that I want to be able to say, and I didn't feel I was getting. There's some nub of an issue there that is very important, and so it's very helpful for Arpad to make that last remark. It sets me thinking.
Okay, thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Björn and Arpad. Lots of food for thought there. I think given the time, we'll just move on.